my name is Marlon Galopon. I am a conversation design senior at Salesforce. I'm very excited to be here at the Chatbot conference. And I'll be talking to you about diversifying your intent data library. That's something we've been working on at Salesforce for the last several months now. And it's a project very near and dear to my heart because it has a lot to do with diversity and inclusion, something that we value very highly at Salesforce. And I'm proud to be part of that initiative. Of course, first of all, the project itself wouldn't have been possible without Greg Bennett, who is our Director of Conversation Design. And I also want to give an extra shout out to Brent Lang, who used to be on our team, but has moved on to a different opportunity outside of Salesforce. But we would not be where we are today without his contributions to this project as well. And I am now just taking over from here going forward. So the biggest problem I see with conversational bots these days is that they can only really listen to and understand a certain kind of English. The reason why is that they're trained on biased data. So oftentimes, bots get trained on a variety of English that is very representative of, say, a mid-30s, mid-40s white male from Mountain View, California. Unfortunately, not all users everywhere are like that. And that's very sad because it means that folks who do not speak that variety of English have a harder time having the bot understand them and execute against their goals and tasks. The solution for being able to increase the varieties of English that a bot can understand is by essentially feeding the bot linguistically inclusive training data. I'm sure some of you have heard of the term garbage in, garbage out, but that's not to say that a particular language or a variety of English is garbage or not. We love all language varieties at Salesforce. But the accents of a particular language variety essentially means that people who speak that language variety will have a harder time accessing and using the product than those who speak the language varieties on which the bot has been trained. So in order to both grow our scope and increase our total addressable market, we want to collect that data, because data makes us happy, from folks who speak all kinds of varieties. So that way we can address these functionalities and bring them to a wider customer base. So with that's how we ended up starting the Inclusive Training Data Project. It is, to our knowledge, the industry's first ever inclusive training data set for chat-based conversational apps. So we know that there are companies out there that do diverse language variety data sampling for voice, but we have yet to really see anything that encapsulates the lexical and syntactic variation one might expect from different varieties of English in chat. And so in doing so, we have four main sort of benchmarks for this project. The first of which is prioritizing historically underrepresented varieties, which we'll get to in a moment. Then building a library of those data, setting a standard based on those data, and drafting a framework about how we can go about collecting this data at scale so that we can continue to expand and iterate on a quick basis. So in terms of the training data themselves, we prioritize 4 dialects: African American English, Chicano English, Southern US English, and English as a second language broadly. The reason why we picked these 4 categories is because they're what we at Salesforce have observed as varieties of English that tend to be historically underrepresented in the conversation design or conversational AI community at large. If you look at the distribution of American English dialects on the graphic on the screen, you'll notice that the Southern US makes up a sizable chunk of the continental US. And it's something that often doesn't necessarily get targeted and accounted for, and bots don't get trained on those. So we wanted to include that. Also, as well as Chicano English, whereby there may be some sort of language transfer from a speaker whose first language is Spanish. And then African American English, which we want to make sure that if you're a Black woman in Mississippi, you don't need to change the way you communicate in order to get a bot to understand you. And then English as a second language broadly. And in doing all of these, picking these languages, we also didn't set any hard and fast rules about what like the first language is, so long as it wasn't English. Along with that, we also wanted to balance against, what we also wanted to balance against was demographic strata. For example, gender identity. We didn't want to overly sample people who identify as female versus people who identify as male or non-binary. We wanted to get as close as we can to a distribution across each. Although from our sample, as you can see from the data right here, non-binary folks or people who identify as non-binary were less represented as we would have liked. And that's something we'll continue sampling against in the future. Other things we looked at was race, education level, and age. All of these different social strata tend to affect language use. And so that was something we wanted to control for to a degree, where the main variable itself is the variety of English. In terms of the library that we're building, we wanted to make it as easy as possible for various teams at Salesforce to build a conversational app that is intent-enabled using this data. So, for example, if a product team was going to create a chatbot and wants to enable an intent such as report an issue, they don't have to source these utterances themselves. It's something that we can just provide because we already collected it through this project. As of right now, we have over 10,000 utterances collected across about 230 research participants. And the process for that was leveraging your traditional sociolinguistic field methods to set up our sort of remote digital first world version of collecting utterances as it pertains to a particular intent. We first started with defining what we mean by a chatbot. Then we provide a sample scenario and then ask them what they would type in chat in that situation. And we also asked for a couple of other variations for how else they would say that same intent. And we also went in with very explicit instructions about not overthinking spelling or punctuation or grammar. Because if we were to do that, that would erase a lot of the linguistic variety and variation that we would want to see in the data. And then we partnered with a third-party vendor to be able to help us reach these research participants and collect the data. In terms of setting a standard, we really wanted to be able to put a stake in the ground in the industry and say, there's plenty of research and research methodology that we can leverage from other fields to be able to do this at scale. Several of our colleagues in Salesforce have a background in sociolinguistics. I myself am not a sociolinguist, but I learned a lot from working with them. And one of the things that they have brought to the table that I learned is how to sample and target specific language varieties or flavors of a given language, and then elicit that from a person without overly biasing them. And this is something where we can hopefully put a standard or practical method of how to go about doing this at scale and impact both the ethical AI space as well as the field of conversation design. It's something that we hope that as a method, as I previously explained regarding the sampling method, we hope it's something that people can quickly pick up and run with themselves in their teams and organizations. In basing our work on sociolinguistics, we leverage a lot in terms of how to responsibly collect diverse data. While the world of sociolinguistics has evolved a great deal over the last 50 years, something that has been of utmost importance in the most recent years is that sociolinguists have been greatly discussing what it means to collect data from these historically underrepresented populations or vulnerable populations and how to make sure they're included in the process. That's partially why we worked with a third-party vendor who we feel like has their own compensation method and relationship with their participants, and to ensure also that we weren't overly sampling in one area ourselves. We're also, we wanted to be very intentional about selecting these particular linguistic varieties because we have seen in the industry that these 4 varieties have been lacking in representation. And as I mentioned, they're informed by standard sociolinguistic field methods. So starting from a language-first approach, asking open-ended questions to elicit as much language as possible, it's like playing a big game of taboo. We want the person to say orange, but we can't say the word orange to them. So what do you say to them in order to get them to say that word? And that's basically the kind of approach that we take. In terms of the impact this has had on our company, it's allowing us to say that we truly live by our values of meeting the users where they are. You can't say that you're meeting the user where they are when it comes to a conversational product if you don't meet them in how they speak. And we are officially going after the types of language construction that signify and represent these varieties of English that have yet to have been fully incorporated into conversation design. So we're making our bots flexible enough to understand a dialect without issue because we're representing it in the US corpus. The bot consumes it and in turn increases our overall addressable market where hopefully our bots and conversational apps at Salesforce can be seen across the industry as the most inclusive and easiest to use because as a user, I don't have to change the way that I talk in order to get it to understand. So that was it. Thank you for your time. I hope this was informative to you. I see Greg is also with us here today. Maybe is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think you covered it. Okay. I see we have a question in the chat. How
do I see the question? Oh,
awesome.
The question is, can we buy this training data? I defer to you, Greg, on this. I think what our hope is that we're wanting to be able to make it available to our customers. Maybe Greg has a little more vision around that.
Sure. I mean, I think if you're a Salesforce customer, let's definitely talk. And if you're not, stay tuned. Will Salesforce partner companies have access to this library of diverse training data? Yes. Just reach out. Feel free to, our email addresses are on the screen, so feel free to ping us. And then I think there's a question that Peter also asked around reluctance from marginalized communities to assist big tech with getting this right. So we, I believe you mentioned this, Marlinda, we work with a third-party vendor to gather the data. And so that is something that I would defer to the vendor that we use to gather the data, since we don't gather the data directly.
Great. Yeah, keep the questions coming.
Ooh, there's lots of them.
Oh, I know. Okay. Yeah, it was a great talk. I mean, like, I think this is one of the reasons why people came is for this sort of talk. How do you resolve conflicts and intents or entities when dealing with multiple skills? Can you hear me on that one?
Yeah. Or were you able to hear it, Marlinda?
It's a little muffled on my from me.
Okay, I was so far away from the microphone. That's probably why. So, Marlinda, how do you resolve conflicts and intents or entities when dealing with multiple skills?
Conflicts and when dealing with multiple skills, like in what way do you mean?
I imagine that, and Paye can tell us more about what they mean, but I imagine maybe if a use case has overlapping intents and entities, or maybe two or more use cases have overlapping intents or entities, or overlapping follow-up intents or entities, then how do you resolve these sort of conflicts when dealing with multiple good possibilities?
I think that's something that we're still continuing to watch out for as we collect more data. Definitely, the more data that we have, the more we're able to see and make the connections between the patterns and utterances and how they connect to each intent.
Okay. How do you divide the load between live agents and bot? And how do you recognize when you should do one versus the other, and so on?
When you say, like, do you mean when a user lands on a web page, how do we know when to send them to a bot or a live agent? Or
No, that was, never mind. That was a bad question. We'll just ignore it. We'll move on. It never happened.
there are no bad questions.
Okay. So what sort of features seem to indicate different dialects in text? Is it spelling, abbreviation, punctuation? Like what does it entail?
All of the above. There people will I can give you an example. There are certain ways that people will spell names that I know you're Filipino. So I'm Filipino.
Okay.
My favorite ones is H's. You will take the name Jennifer, but then you will see a name Jennifer that is spelled Jenenher. Jennifer. But and I know that's Filipino because I don't, and no one can tell me why. I have asked my relatives, friends, and they're just like, because it's unique. But and I have not seen this in any other culture, but I just know. But yeah, so spelling, word choice, and order, all of that can kind of indicate.
Yeah. Anything to add, Greg?
Nope. Yeah, no, Marlinda hit the nail on the head there. I can't think of anything else because we're talking about text here. Like if we were talking about voice and sound, then we would incorporate a little bit more of the sort of socio-phonetic variation we would expect. But Marlinda already covered, like a user would compensate for that with spelling. So what Marlinda said.
What she said. Okay, and so you really need to have you need to know about the H's, because I had no idea about H's in your example.
Like ages?
No, H's. The letter.
Oh
H.
yes, yeah.
Jennifer.
Yeah. Jennifer, yeah. So you need to have someone that understands all these different variations and so on.
Yes. This is something that I've only seen within the Filipino community. Just I don't know, we'll just pick a normal name and put an H in it. David, Davhid.
That's hilarious. Okay, so we have another question. Daniel asks, ESL so diverse, how were you able to make use of that in a particular group? Since there's such variety and diversity in language, how are you able to make use of this in a particular group?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? It's kind of muffled. I'm so sorry. Don't mind my forehead while I try to listen.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So Daniel asks, ESL is so diverse. How were you able to make use of that as a particular group? In other words, there's some like similarities with Hispanic, Chicano culture with Natalie with an H versus Natalie without an H. And this is a Natalie saying it, so I believe her.
Greg, I defer to you on that one.
Okay.
Sure. So part of the reason why we didn't kind of like get a little bit more specific around the different kind of like L1 is what we call the first language of the speaker, was potentially because that was part of it was a constraint on the project around time and funding. But the hope is that to be able to kind of cut across broadly, because we have a pillar representing strictly Chicano English, that we would get some of those features you might expect. Like, so for example, like because of the influence or language transfer from the first language of Spanish, you might get some sort of misgendering or mismatching pronoun, like, subject, object, verb agreement, that kind of a thing. But that we would see potentially slightly, like not necessarily similar, but like related variations across languages that have other L1s. So for example, if someone's first language is Russian or Ukrainian, we might see a slightly different variation that may not otherwise be picked up. And the hope is to then kind of, at least in the first pass, while it's not perfect, we may not be able to distinguish entirely, that we can at least get that representation in there now with the hope of being able to expand it further with greater detail later on.
Got it. That's very interesting. Okay. Yeah, I mean, fascinating stuff. What else would you guys like to add? Anything that you think that the audience should think about? Or maybe it's a question that you wish you would get asked more often.
I mean, the one that comes to me is like, I guess the question that I wish I would get asked more often, and what I would also like to add is like, what variety of English are we training against? That I think is a question everybody should ask themselves, because if you're only training against one, that's the only one that the bot is going to be able to handle. So for example, like when Marlinda was talking about Filipino English, I'm glad that she is a speaker of that, because I am not, which means she'll be able to identify the variations in the corpus. What Marlinda has presented today is just phase 1 of this project. Phase 2 will move into world Englishes, one of which will be Filipino English. And that's an important thing to consider. I mean, if you're in the customer service industry, the Philippines and India are two very popular BPOs where people have organizations of customer service. And so if they are interacting with, say, some kind of assistant that is to help the agent, then it's going to be important to make sure that you have that kind of representation in your training data.
I see. And I'm sure that it's like a gradient, like English in the United States, like whether I go to Florida or Alabama or Texas, I can understand them mostly 90%.
Yeah.
Right. And so on. And then once you expand outside, like British English, I think is a little harder for me probably. And then, Filipino English, well, depends on the speaker.
Or like Indian English, for example. I mean, there's whole, like, I don't know very much about Indian English, but what I do know about it, very sort of like on the surface level, is fascinating to me, in that there's whole new lexical items in that variety of English that don't exist in US English, that I think is fascinating. And like, when I think about it as a linguist, I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. Why don't we do that too? So there's this word called prepone.
Say it again, prepone?
Prepone, which is the opposite of to postpone.
To prepone.
So to bring it earlier, which I'm like, oh my God. Like, and so the prefix in English means to do before, to do in advance. To fix that to the affix pone seems like a totally normal thing to do, a totally reasonable thing to do verbally and linguistically. And so if you're communicating that to a bot, and the bot doesn't know that prepone could be, a word that signifies to move something up earlier rather than later, then you have a challenge there. So those are the kinds of things that I think are really important about this kind of work.
Yeah, even like, so in some languages have a lot of variety of and a bigger depth in terms of the things that they could express, right? Like in English, where it's like over 1 million words, and I think it's very specialized. But if you go to German, you can create your own verbs and you can create your own nouns.
Oh, right? Yes.
And so when you have a German speaker that comes in and starts speaking English, they might prepone a lot of things.
Yes. Yeah, sure. Right, right. Or I mean, even if, like, for example, you know, like what comes to mind for me, like in Spanish, for example, when I hear people refer to others in like affectionate terms, it's always
Yeah.
so much grander and more like,
Yeah.
just like intense and passionate than in English, where they're like, they call you like my heart, my love, my life. I'm just like, oh, I just call my partner by their name, like, so like there's all these very I think all that to say is that there's these idiosyncrasies about each language that potentially sometimes get transferred over into English when English is the second language that's spoken, or there's some sort of language contact between the first language and English that should be celebrated rather than like normalized or erased, because we lose that variability and then it becomes a usability issue.
Right. So one last question, and let me pick a good one. Okay, so Igor is asking about metrics. He says, out of curiosity, do you have some metrics between regular chatbots where we don't have this kind of cultural language inclusion affecting the intents match versus a chatbots that have it? Is there what's the difference in
So
metrics?
that is a stay tuned for the next episode in the
Okay.
series called Salesforce Conversation Design. That is actually
Yeah.
something that we're working on right now with our research partners and research and insights. So can't go into it quite yet, but we will
Okay.
be sharing that
Yeah.
soon.
If I had to guess, I would assume that it would build trust more quickly. That would be my biggest assumption.
All right.
Though,
I'm excited. Yes. I have to tease the next album.
okay.
We'll be back on tour.
All right. All right. So we'll have you back when we're in the fall.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Okay. So Igor, come back in October, and then Greg will tell you the secrets of the metrics. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. It was great having you here. Please.